You know that person who can entertain themselves for hours without a phone? Who doesn't panic when plans fall through? Who seems weirdly comfortable with silence and boredom? Who fixes things themselves before calling for help? There's a good chance they grew up in the 90s. And before you think this is just another back-in-my-day nostalgia trip, it's not. This isn't about which generation had it harder or better. This is about understanding how growing up in that specific decade created a distinct psychological profile that still shapes behavior today. Because if you grew up in the 70s, you were raised in a world that operated on completely different assumptions about childhood, safety, independence, and what kids actually need to thrive. And those assumptions, whether right or wrong, wired your brain in ways that make you fundamentally different from people raised just 1 or 2 decades later. Stick with me, because what shaped their minds might explain behaviors you see every day. Behaviors that seem strange or impressive or frustrating depending on your perspective. The world they grew up in. Let me paint you a picture of what childhood actually looked like in the 1970s. Not the sanitized nostalgia version, the actual messy, sometimes scary, often amazing reality. You're 7 years old. It's Saturday morning. You wake up in your room with the shag carpet and wood-paneled walls. You pad down to the kitchen in your pajamas. Your dad's reading the newspaper, the actual paper newspaper. Your mom's at the counter. You pour yourself a bowl of cereal, probably something that would be considered a dessert today. You eat it while watching cartoons on one of 3 channels. The TV has to warm up. You have to get up to change the channel. There's no remote. Around 9 a.m., your mom says, "Go outside and play. Be back when the streetlights come on." That's it. That's the entire instruction. No follow-up questions about where you'll be. No checking in required. No text me when you get there. Because there is no there. You're just out. No cell phone to check in. No GPS tracker on your bike. No scheduled play date. No parent hovering at the playground. No itinerary of activities designed to optimize your development. You grab your bike. You have roughly 8 to 10 hours of completely unstructured, unsupervised time. And this wasn't considered risky parenting. This was normal. This was every single kid on your block, every single day of summer, every weekend, every day after school until dinner. Your parents had no idea where you were most of the time. Not because they didn't care, but because the assumption was kids roam, kids play, kids come home. That's how it works. There were no cell phones, no way to reach you, no way for you to reach them. If you needed help, you had to find it. Knock on a door, find a payphone, figure it out. So what did you do with all that time? You roamed. You explored. You knocked on doors to see who could come out. Can Tommy play? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. You kept knocking until you found someone. You built forts in the woods out of scrap wood you found. You played elaborate games of make-believe that lasted for hours, sometimes days. You were astronauts, soldiers, explorers, detectives. The games had complex rules you made up as you went. You climbed trees, knowing full well you might fall. And you did fall. You learned which branches could hold your weight and which couldn't. No adult was standing below to catch you. You climbed anyway. You rode your bike to places your parents had never been and probably didn't know existed. The creek 2 miles away, the abandoned lot, the construction site where they were building new houses and you could explore the frames before the walls went up. You got into minor trouble trespassing, breaking something accidentally, getting chased by an angry dog, arguing with other kids, getting dirty beyond recognition, and you figured out how to get out of it or handle it before any adult found out. You learned negotiation, conflict resolution, risk assessment, problem solving, all without adult mediation. When you got hurt, and you did get hurt regularly, you didn't call anyone because there was no one to call. You just dealt with it. Scraped knee from falling off your bike, wiped the blood on your jeans. Keep playing. The sting fades after a while. Cut your hand on something sharp, run it under the garden hose in someone's backyard, wrap it in your shirt. If it's still bleeding in an hour, maybe think about telling someone. Twisted your ankle jumping off something you probably shouldn't have been on? Sit down for a few minutes, test it. If you can walk, you're fine. Limp home later. The injury had to be pretty serious before you'd actually go home and tell an adult. Why? Because telling an adult meant the fun ended. You'd get brought inside, cleaned up, maybe scolded for whatever risky thing you were doing, possibly banned from going out again that day. So you learned to self-triage, to manage pain, to push through minor injuries, not because you were tough, because staying outside was worth it. When you were bored, which happened often and for long stretches, no one handed you entertainment. There was no iPad, no streaming service, no YouTube, no video games, or if you were lucky enough to have an Atari, you had maybe 3 cartridges and you'd played them 1,000 times already.
If you were lucky, you had 3 TV channels, PBS, and 2 networks.
They showed what they showed on their schedule. If cartoons ended at noon, that was it. No more cartoons. You didn't get to choose. You watched what was on, or you watched nothing. Most of the time, there was nothing on worth watching. Test patterns, soap operas, shows for adults. So you turned off the TV and faced the vast emptiness of time. So boredom became a problem you had to solve yourself. And you did, over and over again. Sticks became swords, rifles, magic wands, tools, cardboard boxes became forts, spaceships, cars, houses, dirt became an entire landscape for your toy soldiers or action figures. Imagination wasn't optional, it was survival. You put on elaborate plays for neighborhood kids. You created entire newspapers with hand-drawn comics and made up stories. You built cities out of blocks and then destroyed them with imaginary monsters. You dug holes for no reason except to see how deep you could go. The boredom forced creativity, and that creativity became a foundational skill. This created something that psychologists now recognize as free-range resilience. The ability to self-regulate, self-entertain, self-soothe, and self-rescue without constant external input or adult intervention. But it created other things too. Some adaptive, some not, and that's what we need to understand. The first type, the self-reliant problem solver. Let's start with the most visible pattern. The person who, when something breaks, immediately tries to fix it themselves. Who doesn't Google every question? Who seems almost uncomfortable asking for help? Who would rather spend 3 hours figuring something out than 5 minutes asking someone who knows? These people learned very early that if something was wrong, you figured it out. Not because adults were cruel or neglectful, but because there simply wasn't a culture of constant intervention. Help wasn't always readily available, so you learned not to expect it. Fell off your bike? Get back on. Nobody's calling your parents to come pick you up. The training wheels came off when you were 5, and after that, scraped knees and bruised egos were just part of learning. You either figured out how to balance, or you kept falling. Eventually, you figured it out. Lost your toy somewhere in the 3-block radius you were allowed to roam? Retrace your steps. Ask the other kids if they saw it. Check the yards you played in. Nobody's driving you around the neighborhood to look for it. You either find it or you don't. And if you don't, you learn to keep better track of your stuff next time. Can't figure out how your new toy works? Keep trying. Experiment. There's no YouTube tutorial to walk you through it. The instructions are either in the box, usually one poorly drawn diagram, or they don't exist. You tinker until you figure it out, or you break it trying. Either way, you learn. Scared of the dark basement? Too bad. That's where the freezer is, and Mom needs you to get the hamburger meat for dinner. You're going down there. You can turn on the light, but then you have to walk into the darkness to reach it. And you do, because the alternative is admitting you're too scared, and that's worse than facing the dark. This constant low-level problem-solving, happening every single day across hundreds of small situations, created a default mental setting that persists into adulthood. I can probably figure this out on my own. Watch them today in any situation where something goes wrong. Their car makes a weird noise. Before scheduling a mechanic appointment, they're under the hood with a flashlight trying to diagnose it themselves. Maybe they'll watch a YouTube video now, but their first instinct is still to try fixing it rather than immediately outsourcing the problem. Their computer acts up. They're Googling error codes, checking forums, attempting fixes, possibly making it worse before making it better. They'll spend hours on this before finally reluctantly calling tech support. Their relationship hits a rough patch. They try to work through it internally, analyze what's wrong, adjust their behavior, hope it resolves. It doesn't occur to them to suggest couples therapy until things are really bad, because therapy feels like admitting defeat. Something breaks in their house. Their first thought is, can I fix this myself, not who should I call? They've got a garage full of tools they've accumulated over the years, half-finished projects, things they're pretty sure they can handle if they just had the right weekend. This isn't about being smarter or more capable than other people. It's about having developed from a very young age the assumption that you are your own first line of defense against problems. That asking for help is what you do after you've exhausted your own resources, not before. that self-sufficiency is a virtue and dependency is something to avoid. The strength here is obvious and genuinely valuable. These people are remarkably self-sufficient. They don't fall apart when something goes wrong. They're excellent in actual emergencies because they default to, what can I do about this right now, rather than panicking. They have genuine confidence in their ability to handle unexpected situations. They're the ones who stay calm when the power goes out, who figure out how to jerry-rig solutions, who don't need perfect conditions or professional help to tackle a problem. They're resourceful, capable, independent. The shadow side is also obvious if you look closely. They often wait too long to ask for help, sometimes turning minor problems into major ones through stubborn self-reliance. They struggle to delegate because they genuinely believe they can do most things better themselves, and sometimes they're right, but that's not the point. They can come across as stubborn, controlling, or arrogant when really they're just operating from their default setting. If I need it done right, I'll do it myself. They don't mean to be dismissive of others' abilities, they just don't think to ask. And often, they've confused self-reliance with isolation, because when you spend your formative years learning that you're basically on your own for problem solving, it's incredibly hard to unlearn that pattern even when you're surrounded by people who are willing and able to help. They're the ones who struggle most with vulnerability, with admitting they don't know something, with accepting help gracefully when it's offered, because deep down, needing help still feels like failure. The second type, the analog connector. Here's something that fundamentally shaped 1970s kids in a way that's hard to explain to people who grew up digital. Social connection required physical presence, always, without exception. You didn't text your friend to make plans. You didn't DM them. You didn't send a quick message to see if they were around. You walked to their house, sometimes several blocks, and you knocked on the door. You stood there hoping someone would answer, hoping your friend was home, hoping they were allowed to come out. Can Sarah come out? You'd ask Sarah's mom. Sometimes Sarah wasn't home, sometimes she was grounded, sometimes she was doing chores or homework or at her grandma's house, and you'd only find out by physically going there and asking. So what did you do? You walked to the next house, and the next one. Sometimes you'd knock on 5 or 6 doors before finding someone who could play, or you'd find nobody and have to entertain yourself. This created a completely different relationship with friendship and social connection. First, it was effort-based. Seeing your friends required actual physical work. You had to move your body through space. You had to walk, bike, risk being told no or nobody's home. Friendship wasn't frictionless. It required showing up, literally. This meant that the friends you did have, you invested in, because maintaining those connections took real effort. You valued them more. You didn't have hundreds of friends. You had maybe 5 or 6 real ones and a broader group of neighborhood kids you played with. Second, it was completely unfiltered. You saw your friends at their actual worst. You saw them bored, messy, annoyed with their siblings, fighting with their parents. You were in their homes regularly. You saw how they really lived, not the curated version. There was no performing for social media. No staging, no waiting for the perfect moment. You showed up at their door, and they answered it in whatever state they were in. Maybe they just woke up. Maybe they'd been crying about something. Maybe their house was a mess. You saw all of it. This created friendships based on actual knowledge of who someone really was, not who they pretended to be. Third, it was spontaneous and flexible. Plans were loose. See you tomorrow after school was as specific as it got. You showed up at the designated place and figured it out from there. What are we doing today? Don't know. Let's ride bikes. Where? Don't know. We'll figure it out. Nobody needed advance notice. Nobody needed an itinerary. You just existed together in real time and did whatever seemed interesting. Today, these people often struggle deeply with digital communication and modern friendship norms. Not because they're technologically incompetent, many of them adapted fine to technology. They have smartphones. They know how to text. But digital interaction fundamentally doesn't satisfy their need for connection the way face-to-face interaction does. Watch them in a text conversation. They'll keep it brief, functional. Want to grab dinner? Thursday at 7? They're using it as a logistics tool, not as a way to actually connect. But put them in person with someone, and they come alive. They're present, attentive. They listen fully instead of composing their next message while you're talking. They read body language. They respond to tone. They notice things. They're the ones who will say, "Can we just call instead of texting about this?" When something becomes complicated or emotional. because typing feels inadequate for real conversation. They're the ones who suggest meeting in person even when it's inconvenient, who show up unannounced sometimes, which can feel intrusive or even aggressive to younger people who need advance notice and mental preparation for everything. They value physical presence in a way that seems almost excessive now. They want to be in the same room. They want eye contact. They want to share physical space. They're confused and sometimes frustrated by friendships that exist entirely through social media. Someone they haven't seen in person for 2 years still considers them close friends because they interact online regularly. But to them, that's not friendship, that's something else. Performance maybe, simulation. For them, real connection meant being in the same physical space, breathing the same air, experiencing real-time reaction and interaction. Anything less feels like a poor substitute, not an equally valid form of connection. The strength here is genuine depth and presence. When they're your friend, they're really your friend. They show up, they're there. They invest actual time and physical presence, not just digital tokens of attention. They maintain friendships through decades because those friendships are based on real shared experience, not just shared content consumption. They know how to be present with someone without distraction. Their phone stays in their pocket. They listen fully, they're there. The shadow side is inflexibility and sometimes judgment. They struggle to maintain connections with people who've moved away or who prefer digital communication. Geography matters too much to them. If you're not physically accessible, the friendship tends to fade. They can be critical or dismissive of younger people's friendship styles without recognizing that different doesn't mean worse or less real. They sometimes mistake their preference for superior wisdom. And they struggle with the reality that in a modern distributed world, insisting on only analog connection means having fewer connections overall. The third type, the boredom architect. Here's something that almost doesn't exist anymore. Prolonged, unstructured boredom. 1970s kids spent hours with absolutely nothing to do. No screens, no scheduled activities. Just time, empty, slow, seemingly endless time. Summer days stretched out forever. You'd wake up, have breakfast, then face 10 hours of absolutely nothing planned. Nobody was entertaining you, nobody was driving you to activities, nobody had organized your day. And in that emptiness, something remarkable happened. Creativity didn't just emerge, it exploded. Not the structured, adult-facilitated let's do an art project creativity. The desperate, inventive, often weird creativity that comes from a mind with absolutely no external stimulation. They built elaborate imaginary worlds with complex backstories and rules. They created games that would last for weeks, with evolving narratives and character development. They wrote stories, drew maps of fantasy kingdoms, invented secret languages, built structures out of whatever they could find, all because there was literally nothing else to do. This created adults with a completely different relationship to boredom and stimulation. Today, they're the ones who don't need constant input, who can sit quietly without immediately reaching for their phone, who can be alone with their thoughts without anxiety, who create for the sake of creating, not for content or validation or even necessarily to share. They're comfortable with silence, with empty time, with the space between events, because they learned early that boredom isn't a problem to be fixed by someone else, it's a canvas. Watch them in waiting rooms. They're not scrolling, they're thinking, observing. Sometimes literally staring into space, and they're fine with it. Ask them about hobbies. They often have these deep, involved solo interests. Model building, woodworking, painting, writing, gardening. Things that require sustained attention and provide intrinsic satisfaction. The strength is creative resilience and independence. They're not addicted to stimulation. They can generate their own interest, their own entertainment, their own meaning. The shadow side is sometimes disconnection from modern culture. They can be judgmental about people's need for constant entertainment. They might not understand why someone needs to check their phone every 5 minutes, and their judgment can come across as superiority. They also sometimes mistake tolerance for boredom with actual fulfillment. Just because you can sit alone in an empty room for hours doesn't mean it's always healthy to do so. The fourth type, the boundary navigator. 1970s kids learned to navigate risk without safety nets in a way that's almost unthinkable now. You climbed trees knowing you might fall, and you did fall, and you learned to climb better, or you stopped climbing. But the consequence wasn't a hospital trip unless bones were involved. It was scrapes and bruises you treated yourself. You explored neighborhoods and woods knowing you might get lost. And you did get lost. And you figured out how to find your way home using landmarks, asking strangers, backtracking. You learned navigation. You tried things knowing you might fail. Building a bike ramp, skateboarding down a hill, convincing your friends to dig a massive hole to see how deep we can go. Most of these things failed or went sideways, and the consequence wasn't adult intervention, it was learning what doesn't work. This created adults with a fundamentally different relationship to risk and failure. They're less afraid of trying new things because failure was just part of childhood, not a disaster that required parental rescue and damage control. They're also better at reading actual danger versus perceived danger, because they had to develop that skill early. You learn the difference between this might hurt but I'll be fine, and this could actually seriously injure me. That's a crucial distinction that you can only learn through experience, not through being told. Today, they're the ones who seem unusually calm when things go wrong. Plans fall apart. They adapt. Unexpected obstacle appears. They find another way. Risk presents itself. They assess it clearly without either ignoring it or catastrophizing it. They raised kids, many of them, and struggled with how much freedom to give. Because they remember having almost total freedom and surviving. But they also see the modern world as more dangerous, whether it actually is or not. The strength is genuine courage and adaptability. They've internalized that failure and pain are survivable and often educational. They don't need perfect conditions to act. The shadow side is sometimes recklessness or lack of empathy for people who are more risk-averse. They can push their kids or partners into situations that feel unsafe, not understanding that their comfort with risk isn't universal. The hidden cost nobody talks about. But here's what nobody really discusses about 1970s childhoods. All that independence, all that freedom, all that self-reliance came with a significant emotional price for many people. When you learn from age 5 that adults aren't always going to be there when you need them, you stop expecting them to be there. When you learn to process your feelings alone because there's no one around to help you process them, you never develop the skill of emotional co-regulation. Many 1970s kids became emotionally self-sufficient to a fault. They learned not to cry because who would comfort them? They learned not to complain because nobody wanted to hear it. They learned not to ask for emotional support because that wasn't really a thing that was offered. Toughen up. Shake it off. Don't be a baby. These weren't considered harsh. They were considered character building. So they built character. Strong, independent, resilient character. But sometimes at the expense of vulnerability, emotional literacy, and the ability to ask for help when they actually need it. Today, these are the people who struggle to express feelings, who pride themselves on not being a burden, who have difficulty accepting help even when it's freely offered, who interpret needing emotional support as weakness. They're excellent in crisis, terrible at admitting they're struggling. They'll help everyone else. They'll barely mention their own problems. And many of them carry a complicated relationship with the next generation. They gave their own children the supervision, the emotional support, the constant attention they never had. And sometimes they look at those children and wonder if they created people who can't function without constant support. We survived without all this. Why can't they? But that question misses something important. Yes, you survived, but did you thrive? Did you develop healthy emotional regulation? Did you learn to be vulnerable? Did you learn that needing help is human, not weak? Or did you just learn to cope alone? There's also a quiet resentment some carry. They were independent because they had to be, not because they wanted to be. Some of them would have loved more attention, more supervision, more emotional support, but that wasn't available, so they adapted. And now they watch younger generations receive what they never had, and instead of feeling glad about progress, some feel bitter, like they were shortchanged. The reframe. What this all means? So here's the truth about growing up in the 1970s. It created a specific psychological profile. Not better, not worse, just different. These people developed remarkable self-reliance, the ability to entertain themselves, comfort with boredom, creative problem-solving, genuine independence, resilience. But they also developed, in many cases, emotional guardedness, difficulty asking for help, discomfort with vulnerability, skepticism toward people who need more support. The world has changed dramatically. Childhood in 2024 looks nothing like childhood in 1974. constant connectivity, structured activities, risk mitigation, parental involvement in every aspect of development. These aren't wrong. They're different trade-offs for a different world. The 1970s approach created independent, resourceful people who sometimes struggle with emotional connection. The modern approach creates emotionally literate, supported people who sometimes struggle with independence. Neither is perfect. Both are adaptations to their specific environments. If you grew up in the 70s, maybe the lesson isn't that kids today are soft. Maybe it's that different eras require different skills, and both sets of skills are valuable. Your self-reliance is absolutely a strength in a world that can be unpredictable, but so is the ability to ask for help and build genuine interdependent relationships. Your comfort with boredom is a superpower in an overstimulated world, but connection still matters, even if it looks different than it did on your childhood street. Your ability to handle failure is crucial, but so is the ability to be vulnerable about when you're actually struggling. You learn to be alone, to solve your own problems, to entertain yourself, to survive disappointment. Those are real skills. But maybe now, in midlife or beyond, the growth edge isn't more independence. Maybe it's learning to let people in, learning to admit when you need support, learning that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's connection. The final question: so which type are you? The self-reliant problem solver who can fix anything but struggles to ask for help when you actually need it? The analog connector who shows up in person, who values face-to-face time above all else, but struggles with digital distance? The boredom architect who creates constantly, who can sit with silence, but sometimes judges people who need stimulation? The boundary navigator who handles risk well, who stays calm in chaos, but sometimes pushes others too hard or misreads their comfort levels? Or maybe you're a mix of all four. Most people are. You fix things yourself, and you value analog connection, and you're comfortable with boredom, and you navigate risk well. These patterns aren't mutually exclusive. They're interwoven parts of a larger psychological profile. And here's the deeper, more challenging question. What would happen if you took the best of what you learned growing up, the resilience, the creativity, the self-sufficiency, the ability to be present, and let go of the parts that actually isolate you from others and from growth? What if your self-reliance could coexist with vulnerability? What if you could be proud of your ability to solve problems while also recognizing that asking for help is sometimes the wisest solution, not a character flaw? What if your comfort with boredom and your creative self-sufficiency could coexist with appreciation for how others find meaning and connection, even if it looks different from your way? What if your resilience and risk tolerance could make space for others' different needs and boundaries without dismissing them as weakness or overprotection? What if your desire for face-to-face connection could expand to recognize that digital connection, while different, isn't inherently inferior or fake? The 1970s shaped you profoundly. The freedom, the independence, the necessity of self-reliance, these things created real strengths that serve you well in many situations. But they don't have to limit you to only one way of being. They don't have to make you dismissive of people who develop different adaptive strategies for different circumstances. You survived that childhood. You developed real valuable strengths from it. But survival and thriving are fundamentally different things. And maybe the work now, in midlife or beyond, is learning that asking for help, showing emotion, needing people, accepting digital connection, and admitting vulnerability aren't signs that you've become soft or lost what made you strong. Maybe they're signs that you've grown beyond survival mode into actual thriving. That you're secure enough in your independence to risk interdependence. That you're confident enough in your strength to show weakness when it's real. The world has changed, but you can change with it while keeping what's valuable from how you were raised. You learn to be alone, to solve your own problems, to entertain yourself, to handle failure and disappointment, to navigate risk, to show up physically. Those are real skills with real value. But maybe now the growth edge isn't developing more of those skills. Maybe it's learning what you missed while developing them. You survived that childhood. Now the question is, what would it mean to truly thrive?